What if the rules we follow in court were being written by people who never appear in court? It had been months since the courthouse incident that made Pam Bondi a household name again. Months since that tiny flag pin set off a national reckoning about justice, symbolism, and silence. The media storm had passed, but something deeper had stayed. Pam had returned to her quieter life, mentoring young attorneys, speaking at legal ethics forums, occasionally consulting for complex civil cases. She wasn't looking to stir things up, not again, not yet. But trouble never needed an invitation. It started with an email. A young female attorney, mid-30s, small firm out of Austin, reached out with a simple message. Turned away from court today, necklace shaped like Texas. No warning, no appeal. They said it could trigger state-based sentiment. Ever heard of that? Pam blinked. State-based sentiment? Another day, another rule. Another justification dressed as neutrality. She asked for details. The response came fast. No official memo, no press release. Just a bailiff reading from a laminated sheet taped to the desk. All non-numeral accessories must be removed to preserve courtroom focus. Pam felt the burn rise in her chest. Not again. She replied kindly, asked for permission to look into it. The lawyer agreed. That night, just before bed, Pam received a second message. This one wasn't signed. No greeting, no pleasantries, just one sentence. This goes higher. Attached, a list of dates, initials, and court codes. No context, no explanation, but Pam knew enough to recognize a pattern. The dates all aligned with recent reports of denied courtroom access. The initials matched names she had seen before, attorneys, clerks, even judges. And the court codes? All federal. All in districts with rising complaints of symbol-based disruption. Her instincts kicked in. She didn't panic. She printed the list, highlighted the dates, pinned it to her home office wall, and stared. For a long time. Because Pam had fought policies before, she had battled bias, she had stood firm against silencing tactics, but what this felt like wasn't random. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It felt coordinated, cold, intentional. Someone or some group was rewriting what justice looked like inside the courtroom, not by changing the law, but by reshaping the culture, quietly, strategically, from within. Pam didn't know their names, but she knew the system well enough to feel the shift. And if her flag pin was the spark, this was the fire they'd tried to control, but it was still burning. What if someone was rewriting justice, not with laws, but with invisible hands behind the bench? Pam Bondi had seen patterns before, legal, political, human, but this one felt different. This wasn't just case law drifting toward overreach or judges interpreting statutes too broadly. No, this was movement, synchronized, choreographed, hidden in plain sight. She dug in. The list from the anonymous message became her starting point. She mapped each case, each courtroom, each name. Some were small incidents, denied entry for a cross necklace, a school teacher forced to remove a 9/11 memorial pin, a disabled veteran asked to cover his branch insignia before testifying. Others were more severe, cases dismissed over visual noncompliance, attorneys recused for attire deemed provocative, and one silent suspension that cited symbolic conduct incompatible with courtroom neutrality. It wasn't just inconsistent, it was selective. And when she cross-referenced those courtrooms with a separate list she'd quietly compiled over the years, jurisdictions where procedural transparency had quietly diminished, an even darker pattern emerged. A cluster, a circuit of silence. Pam contacted two old colleagues, one a retired federal prosecutor, the other now a law school dean. She didn't share everything, not yet. Just a question. Have you seen this shift in courtroom decorum policies post-flag pin? The answers came back faster than she expected. A tightening yes. No clear source. Judges say it's internal. Some clerks told me they got new training modules, but no one knows who wrote them. Training modules? Pam asked for copies. The next day she received 3 documents labeled Judicial Conduct Update. Internal only. The language was coded, but unmistakable, to preserve institutional focus and reduce emotive interference. Avoidance of flag-adjacent imagery, religious markings, military affiliations. Judicial discretion encouraged to maintain neutral optics. No signatures, no agency seals, no origins. It read like it had written itself. Pam stared at the phrasing, flag-adjacent imagery. That wasn't a legal term, it was a euphemism. Someone somewhere was formalizing a language of erasure, clean, sterile, depersonalized. She'd seen this kind of vocabulary before, not in the Constitution, but in systems afraid of human symbols. Systems obsessed with control. And then, a breakthrough. Late one night, an email popped up from an address she didn't recognize. Subject, still watching. No text, just an attachment. A PDF, confidential, titled Judicial Order Committee Internal Structure and Protocol. Pam's breath caught. She opened it. Page 1, a flow chart. At the top, a title, JOMC, Judicial Order Committee. Below that, subcommittees Optics Enforcement, Narrative Consistency, Symbolic Discretion. Dozens of acronyms, no full names. But buried 3 pages in, one phrase stood out. Purpose: reassert federal courtroom neutrality via interpretive power, not policy change. Quiet consensus equals sustainable influence. Interpretive power. They weren't changing laws. They were changing how laws were seen. Pam printed it, annotated every margin, then sat back in her chair. She wasn't shocked. Not really. Just confront. This was the machine. It didn't march or shout. It whispered. It layered rules beneath rules until no one knew where authority ended and preference began. She contacted the young lawyer from Austin again. Have you heard of the JOC? There was a pause, then a reply. Not directly, but a bailiff once told me decorum comes from above, higher than judges. I laughed. He didn't. Pam didn't laugh either. This was no longer about what could be worn in court. This was about who got to decide what neutral looked like and who got erased in the process. The next day, Pam met with a former student, now an attorney at a civil liberties nonprofit. She laid out the documents, the chart, the policies, and waited for a reaction. The young woman scanned everything in silence. When she looked up, her voice was low. They're not banning expression, Pam. They're branding it. Pam tilted her head. Meaning? They're turning anything expressive into a liability. Not because it's wrong, but because it reminds the system it's being watched. Pam nodded slowly. Yes, that's exactly what this was. Control disguised as calm. Silence disguised as order. And neutrality redefined as a room where only the system got to speak. But that silence was about to break. What if the silence around you wasn't fear, but agreement? Pam Bondi had taken on difficult systems before, but she always believed that once you showed people the truth, clearly, undeniably, someone, somewhere would act. That belief was about to be tested. Armed with the leaked documents, training modules, and mounting testimonies, Pam reached out to her network. She started small, a federal oversight officer, an old friend at the DOJ, and 2 mid-level congressional aides. She didn't ask for action, just eyes. Just verification. The reactions were unsettling. One person never responded. Another said they'd get back to her. And the third, a carefully worded voicemail. Pam, I'm going to pretend I didn't receive this. For your sake. And mine. For your sake. The phrase lingered. Pam wasn't naive. She knew systems protect themselves. But this wasn't resistance. This was evasion. Like they weren't shocked. Like they already knew. She shifted tactics. She sent the chart and excerpts to a constitutional scholar she once debated on live TV, a longtime critic of her positions. If he attacked the JOC publicly, it might trigger broader discussion. But the man declined. There's no policy to challenge Pam, no statute, just tone. It's clever. She could feel the walls pressing in, not with force, but with absence. No pushback, No outrage. Just nothing. That, she realized, was the real danger. Not the rules, but the fact that no one wanted to admit they were being rewritten. Then something worse happened. Pam's internal memo, one she had only printed and shared in 2 closed meetings, showed up online. Not on a news site, on a watchdog blog designed to smear legal figures under the guise of transparency. The headline: Bondi's paranoia seeing conspiracies in courtrooms. It included quotes from her meetings, some distorted, others fabricated entirely. It painted her as unhinged, politically obsessed, unstable. Pam felt the weight in her chest, not from the smear itself, but from what it confirmed. Someone was watching, closely, and not to learn, to discredit. She went quiet for a day, turned off notifications, closed her laptop, sat in her study and stared at the flag pin still resting in its glass box. Was this how it worked now? Expose the truth and become the target? She thought back to something her father once told her, long before she ever stood in a courtroom. If you ever hear nothing after shouting truth, be careful. It means the people listening might not disagree, they might just be deciding what to do about you. Pam opened her laptop again. She wasn't backing down, but she would have to change the game. The real problem wasn't policy. It wasn't language. It was that the system wasn't reacting because it didn't feel threatened. Yet, that would change. Starting now, what if your best weapon was letting people see what no one else dared to say out loud? Pam didn't call a press conference. She didn't publish an op-ed or go on national television. Instead, she scheduled a private roundtable. Just 10 people. No cameras, no reporters, all of them former legal clerks, mid-tier judges, retired investigators, people who knew how the machine worked, and more importantly, knew what it looked like when it started breaking. The location was simple, a law school conference room she'd used years ago to coach moot court teams. But this time, the case wasn't fictional, and the stakes were very real. Pam laid everything out, carefully, calmly. The documents, the pattern of cases, the training modules, the leaked JOC chart. She didn't lecture, she asked questions. Have you noticed shifts in courtroom procedure? Who's assigning these training modules? Have you ever heard the term narrative consistency in a legal context before? At first they hesitated. Then the story started flowing. One former clerk recalled being told to remove all non-numinal language from draft memos, even if it was direct from precedent. A retired judge admitted he had received subtle pressure to set a tone of simplicity in visual courtroom rules, but had never asked where it came from. Another participant had a family member reprimanded for allowing a witness to wear a veteran's pin on the stand. One by one, the anecdotes began to overlap. And that was the point. Pam didn't need outrage. She needed recognition. At the end of the meeting, she handed out red folders. Inside each one, a sanitized, legally reviewed summary of the JOC documents, stripped of names, but rich in structure. I'm not asking you to go public, she said. I'm asking you to confirm what you already know. 3 days later, the first domino fell. A minor legal journal, the Federal Forum, published an anonymous op-ed titled, "When Neutrality Becomes a Ratio." It didn't mention Pam. It didn't mention the JOC. But it used phrases lifted directly from her dossier: symbolic discretion, visual suppression, interpretive enforcement. People noticed. Small blogs began quoting the article. Law students debated its implications on campus forums. And quietly several judges received direct messages with screenshots attached. The message was clear. You're being watched now, too. Pam didn't celebrate. This wasn't victory. This was opening statements. And court had only just begun. What if exposing the truth wasn't the end of the game, but the move they were waiting for? For a few days, it looked like something was shifting. The legal blogosphere buzzed with terms no one had used before. Optics, enforcement, narrative shaping, symbolic discretion. More legal writers began referencing the op-ed from the Federal Forum, often without naming sources, but clearly responding to a deeper conversation rippling under the surface. Pam stayed in the background. She didn't need the spotlight, she just needed the silence to break. But then, just as fast as it had started, something changed. The op-ed vanished. Not taken down, replaced. Same headline, same byline, but the content? Gutted. Rewritten into vague generalities about courtroom decorum, quoting anonymous, concerned professionals who defended stricter appearance policies. Even the original phrases visual suppression, symbolic erasure, were gone. Pam reached out to the editor. No response. Then her inbox started to fill. First, one of the participants from her private roundtable emailed in a panic. His university had quietly removed him from a speaking engagement on judicial transparency. Another wrote that her legal blog's traffic had dropped to 0 overnight. Not blocked, de-indexed, invisible. Pam had seen this tactic before. Algorithmic silence. Not censorship with a bang, but with a whimper. She traced the pattern to a central IP address cluster linked to a third-party moderation vendor used by multiple courts for internal policy training. When she checked the vendor's leadership board, one name jumped out. Not someone she recognized directly, but someone she'd seen in the flowchart, a subcommittee under narrative consistency. Shock wasn't sleeping. It had been watching her moves the entire time, and now it was responding. But this time, not just by erasing content or pressuring writers. This time they came after her. Late one night, Pam received an alert that her personal legal accreditation file had been accessed without authorization. Hours later, an email appeared in her inbox. Subject: Bondi Ethics Review Inquiry pending. Ms. Bondi, a formal inquiry has been initiated into past public comments that may constitute politically motivated professional conduct. You are invited to respond voluntarily before a preliminary review is conducted. Pam froze. This wasn't just pushback. It was the beginning of an attempt to disqualify her. Not in the court of public opinion, but professionally, legally, quietly. She forwarded the email to a lawyer she trusted in confidence. The reply came back quickly. Isn't normal, someone's pulling strings, but it'll look legitimate unless you fight it. Publicly, that was the last word she wanted to hear. Publicly. The whole reason she'd chosen quiet influence, subtle pressure, private meetings, was to avoid feeding the beast that had turned her into a national symbol once before. She didn't want to become the story, but maybe that was no longer a choice, because now the story had chosen her. 2 nights later, she sat alone in her office staring at 2 folders. One held every carefully prepared document, witness story, internal memo, and anonymous testimony she had collected over months. The other? A draft of a public video, statement. Simple, direct, not inflammatory, just facts, just names, just the system laid bare. Pam had always believed in the power of quiet law. But now, the quiet had been corrupted. And if the courtroom wouldn't speak, she would. What happens when you stop trying to silence one voice, only to watch it multiply? Pam didn't go live. She didn't post a dramatic video or stage a press event. Instead, she uploaded a single file to a private server. Then she sent the link to 50 people. Law students, former clerks, journalists, public defenders, retired judges, people who didn't have networks, they were the network. The file was titled JOC, annotated, What They Don't Want on Record. It contained redacted versions of internal documents, timelines of judicial shifts, side-by-side comparisons of public courtroom decorum policies, and quotes from witnesses, each fact-checked, time-stamped, footnoted. She included no commentary, no opinions, just a single line at the top. This is what I found, decide for yourself. Then she waited. Within 24 hours, the link had been shared over 7,000 times. Within 72 hours, a Reddit thread titled "The Courtroom Isn't Neutral, and Here's the Proof" hit the front page. Pam didn't even post it, someone else did. Dozens of lawyers came forward, anonymously, citing their own silent experiences. Moments when they were told to remove something small, to change their tone, to redact a word that felt loaded. None of it illegal. All of it intentional. A TikTok video by a law student. I wore a rainbow pin and got flagged. Thought it was random, now I know it wasn't. Hit 1.2 million views in 2 days. Another user stitched it with, the woman who exposed this is named Pam Bondi, and she might lose her license because of it. Suddenly the silence was gone, not replaced by noise, but by stories. And stories were powerful in a way policies could never be. Pam watched it unfold from her kitchen, tea untouched, inbox exploding. People were asking questions now, not about her, about the system. Even critics of Pam, those who once accused her of chasing the spotlight, began sharing the file. They weren't aligned with her politics, but they couldn't ignore the facts. One viral comment said it best. You don't have to like Pam Bondi to admit this looks bad, real bad. Some major legal publications cautiously entered the conversation, framing it as the jock controversy, noting how a new wave of legal minds were demanding transparency from within. And then, something Pam didn't expect happened. A sitting judge, anonymous but verified, posted an open letter to a professional forum for federal judiciary staff. We failed in our silence, not because we agreed, but because we didn't question. We thought we were protecting the court. We were only protecting the people behind the curtain. Pam read it 3 times. She didn't cry, but something unknotted inside her. Not because she had won, but because she hadn't been alone. What happens when the system that silenced others is forced to speak for itself? The Senate Judiciary Subcommittee had never been more packed. Cameras lined the back wall, reporters jostled for position. There was no branding, no banners, just the seal of the United States and a long row of microphones waiting for names that used to live in shadows. And Pam Bondi was already seated. Her eyes weren't on the crowd, they were locked on the center chair, the one reserved for a representative of the Judicial Order Committee. For weeks, they'd denied the JOC was formal. Now they had no choice but to send someone to speak. He entered quietly. Gray suit, no tie, no introduction. He didn't sit right away. He placed a folder on the table, adjusted the mic, and finally gave his name, Gregory Marsden, a senior advisor in federal court policy enforcement. The title meant little, the power behind it, tremendous. Senator Carver opened the floor. Pam spoke first. But she didn't raise her voice, she didn't quote doctrine or list every violation. Instead, she told one story, about the first woman who contacted her. The Texas lawyer turned away for a necklace shaped like her home state. She paused, then said, that story wasn't the start of a movement. It was the moment I realized one had already begun, in silence. She laid down printed reports, timelines, annotated policies, all sourced, all verified. Every senator received a copy. Then Marsden was asked to respond. He leaned forward and smiled, a measured, polished expression. The JOC is not a policy-making body, he said smoothly. We advise. Courts choose whether to implement decorum standards. There is no coercion. Pam waited, then replied. And yet, a pattern emerged. Consistent language, coordinated training, identical policy updates in districts that never spoke to one another. She leaned in, voice quiet but cutting. Is that coincidence or design? Marsden's smile faded. The room was still, the kind of stillness that precedes collapse. Then Senator Martinez dropped the final card. We have a subpoenaed internal communication, Mr. Marsden. You referred to certain attorneys as visual agitators. Would you like to explain that term? Marsden faltered. He stammered, shifted in his seat, looked around like the room might rescue him. It didn't. The microphone didn't blink. And the cameras didn't look away. Pam watched him, not with satisfaction but with clarity. This wasn't a takedown. This was exposure, and truth, when spoken, wasn't going back in the folder. What if the most powerful reforms don't arrive with applause, but with quiet, irreversible change? 3 weeks passed. No headlines, no breaking news alerts, no dramatic resignations, just silence. But this time, it wasn't suppression. It was the sound of something ending. Courts across 4 federal districts quietly pulled down internal decorum notices. The phrase visual neutrality disappeared from updated clerk manuals. A training module listed under symbolic discretion was archived with no explanation. And the Judicial Order Committee? It wasn't disbanded, but it vanished. Its website redirect returned to 404.4. Its policy language stopped appearing in internal circulars. Staff were reassigned. No one claimed responsibility. No one needed to. Because the pressure wasn't in the spotlight. It was in the scrutiny. Pam didn't post a victory speech. She didn't sit for interviews. But she received a letter, handwritten, no return address. Inside was a printed photo, a young boy standing outside a courthouse, holding a sign. My dad wore the flag, let us wear it too. Pam kept that photo on her desk. She wasn't interested in being remembered as a symbol. She cared more about what symbols were finally allowed to mean again. Meanwhile, at Georgetown Law, a new elective filled faster than expected: Judicial Optics and Expression. The course description was dry, but every student who enrolled knew exactly why they were there. Pam taught the first class. No slides, no syllabus. Just a question written on the board. Who decides what neutrality looks like? A student in the back raised her hand. Is that rhetorical? Pam smiled. No, it's your final exam. Then 6 months later, a memo surfaced. An internal DOJ document titled Courtroom Identity Protection Standards Draft 1. It outlined protections for personal, non-disruptive symbols of cultural, religious, or national significance, so long as they didn't interfere with the process of justice. At the bottom of the draft, 4 names appeared in the advisory team. One of them, Pam Bondi. Pam read the draft once, then again. She didn't make edits. She didn't need to. This wasn't her law. It was everyone's law now. And for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was defending the system. She felt like she had helped restore it. What if the fight was never about the courtroom, but about the quiet moments when you decide who you really are? The world moved on, as it always does. Other stories took over headlines, new cases, new politics, new noise. The silence that once surrounded the JOC now surrounded its absence. But for Pam Bondi, the real aftermath didn't live in the courtroom. It lived in the quieter places. The office hallway where a junior associate finally wore her cross necklace again, no longer tucking it into her collar. The courtroom gallery where a veteran sat in uniform, medals visible, and no one said a word. The classroom where a law student submitted a paper titled Expression is Not Disruption. None of them mentioned Pam by name. They didn't need to, because the lesson wasn't about her. It was about the line between professionalism and erasure, between decorum and obedience, between being silent and being silenced. Pam sat alone one evening, going through old notes and press clippings, not out of nostalgia, but to remind herself that all of it, the risk, the ridicule, the nearly career-ending fallout, had been for something more than headlines. It had been for remembrance, not of her, but of what we forget when we sanitize justice. When we remove the symbols, the stories, the accents, the pins, the things that remind us that justice is not delivered by statues or seals, but by people. And people are not neutral. They're human. Pam once feared she had become the story. Now she realized that had never been the risk. The risk was letting the story die before it reached enough ears. So she chose to keep telling it quietly, in classrooms, in coffee chats with young lawyers, in amicus briefs and policy drafts. Never center stage, just present. Present enough to remind those coming next. If they ask you to remove your voice to enter the room, maybe that's not a room built for justice. Pam Bondi never set out to change the system. She just refused to lie about what she saw. And that, more than any symbol, became the spark that lit 1,000 others. Because silence, when chosen, is dignity. But silence, when enforced, is a warning. And she had learned the hardest, clearest truth of all. Justice doesn't need silence to function. It needs truth to survive.